All right, good afternoon, everybody. I hope that you're doing quite all right. I'm going to be doing this video for my Adventist friends. So if you are Jewish, this is not for you. This series of videos is really not for you. It's for people who are still in the church, who have been asking questions. So in this series, which I'm going to call Adventist Pioneers, we're going to look at things that drove the Baptists and Methodists and all the evangelical people in South America to begin an Adventist movement. And we're going to see and study a little bit to see why they started that Adventist movement. What does it have to do with Judaism and the Bible? And what does it have to do with a Jewish worldview as opposed to an Adventist or a Christian worldview? So in the process, I'm going to show you in this video specifically a general timeline of history so that you have a sense of history. I'm not going to do the whole 1,000 or 2,000 years, it was the later 1,000 years, so it was quite a lot of studying. It's going to take months, so I can't do that to you. So I'm going to give you highlights of history in this video as a timeline to sort of keep in mind. And then once I finish this video, I'm also going to begin showing you, or before I finish this video, I'm going to begin showing you the Seventh-day Adventist timeline a little bit. And then in the next video and beyond, I'll show you more of what the Adventist pioneers wanted to achieve theologically and also in their practice of faith. And also I will show you the timelines that follow their footsteps and what they were open to and the things that they were rejecting. And then, of course, when I conclude this series, I'm going to share a tiny bit about actually not a tiny bit. When I finish this series, I'm going to start getting the 28 questions on doctrine, which was written in the 20th century to help theological students and to make sense of these beliefs and creeds and what they call pillars these days, what the pioneers wanted to establish in the minds of the people and in the faith of the people, etc., in their personal lives as well. So your own path, your own spiritual path, especially if you're an Adventist that's living in Africa, somewhere in Africa. This is more important to you than a Westerner who is a Seventh-day Adventist. Is different from the spirituality of a person who is in the church, whether it's Baptist or whatever. But I want to show you, as you have requested, all these interesting bits. And what I hope to gain at the end is not to convert you to Judaism or convert you to another religion or make you to ditch your faith that you chose. But I feel like, as one who was an Adventist for many years, I owe a little bit of vindication to the Adventist pioneers, because as one who is a rabbinic student now and studying Judaism and especially Jewish law, when it comes to eschatology or the apocalypse, I understand exactly where the Adventist pioneers wanted to get to. So this is not going to be a long video. I'm going to mainly be sharing a timeline with you, explaining a few things and a few events in this time. Let me just get my Word document out quickly. All right. So I view this as a Christian timeline as opposed to a biblical timeline. It's not a biblical timeline. It's a Christian timeline. Even though if you ask people when did Christianity begin, they'll say in the first century, but it's not so. Christianity goes back even before the date that I'm going to start with on this Word document. As you can see, I've got 332 BCE, what used to be before Christ in old language. Um, Actually, the essence of Christianity begins with actually an Israelite king named Jeroboam, who started introducing false worship into Judaism. So by saying false worship, I don't mean to offend anyone, but let me start explaining this timeline to you. So Christianity goes back. I can even tell you that Christianity goes as far back as the golden calf, but I would be seemingly offensive to someone if I say that. One day I will show it to you when I teach, when you are courageous enough to learn the Torah. But for now, I just want a basic timeline for you to understand that Christianity doesn't start from the first century. It was always there, but it wasn't called Christianity. Right, so let's go to my little document here. So what I want you to understand first off is just a few dates in history, okay? About 332 BCE, or before the birth, the Greeks arrived in the Holy Land, okay? 332 BCE, Alexander and the Greeks arrived to conquer the land. It was very interesting because Alexander didn't come with violence when he came to conquer the land of Israel, even though they intended conquering it. The reason why like he landed on many other shores is because the rabbis teach us that he had a vision of a people that were wearing pure white clothes, and these people were holy. So Alexander came with a lot of respect for the people of Israel, especially the priests, the people whom he would meet. So the Greeks came with the intent of conquering, but the Greeks did not do it violently. They did it through their culture and their civilization, which they introduced and imposed upon the people of Israel. And the people of Israel became Hellenized, or people who are often referred to as Hellenistic Jews. They are nothing but Jews, but who have been westernized in thought, in practice, in beliefs, and everything else. They've been taken away from the Torah in order to live a Greek worldview. And of course, you know, the Greeks also introduced politics into Israel, something that did not exactly exist, politics as we know them today. And the priests started becoming corrupt. They started doing their offerings not because the Torah tells them to do it, but because someone paid money to have their atonement. And if you didn't have money, you almost couldn't get your atonement. That's how corrupt they were. So politics and corruption came with the Greeks in 332. By the year 168 BCE, the Greeks had defiled the temple. This is now, this is the verse of Daniel 8:14. In the Adventist prophecy establishment, Daniel 8:14 is very important because it says that in 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. And then the Adventists, of course, spent a century and a little bit more still debating what this means to this day. It's just part of being a Seventh-day Adventist to delve into this study, but you never get to the thesis because nobody knows the thesis, because no one is established in Hebrew scriptures. The Greeks defiled the temple. They started slaughtering pigs, having sex with prostitutes inside the holy place, introducing idolatry, and they prohibited the Jewish people or the Israelites to not sacrifice for 3 years. So for 3 years, there were no sacrifices being done by the people of Israel because the Greeks had taken over. And then by 164 BCE, a group of priests called the Hasmoneans Hasmoneans or Hasmoneans, they decided that they'd seen enough pagan worship in God's house, and they took up arms and formed a militia that fought against the Greeks, overthrew the Greeks, and pushed them out of Jerusalem into the greater land of Israel. And they were successful. And when the Hasmoneans or Hasmoneans defeated the Greeks, this gave birth to the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. I actually did a video on Hanukkah. Just look on this channel, you will find it. Maybe I'll put it in the description of this video so that you can find it in the description of this video and click on the link to watch that video. So this gave birth to Hanukkah, which is the festival of the 9 lights or the 8 lights of Hanukkah, which happens on the around December time. So when the Hasmoneans kicked out the Greeks, it was the 25th of December. How this 25th of December became Christmas is very interesting. We will do it. I will do a study for you another day for Christmas as to how it came about, why there's a need to be happy and exchange gift and be cheery and jolly on Christmas, is because history tells of a defeat, a spiritual defeat, when the Hasmoneans or Hasmoneans defeated the Greeks and kicked them out of the temple. So the miracle of Hanukkah is that everything was defiled in the temple, but there was one carton of olive oil that was not touched by these unclean hands, and a carton of olive oil was supposed to be 24 hours or 1 day of light, but a miracle happened that this one carton gave light for 8 days of Hanukkah. So where am I going with this timeline so far? Before we go to the Romans, it means that there was pure worship in Jerusalem as God had dictated in the Torah. But when the Kittim, the Greeks, which are called the Kittim in Jeremiah, in the prophecy of Jeremiah, the ships from Kittim that will come to the land of Israel to ravish the land, they arrive. And what do? They impose their religion, and they suppress what we could call loosely as Judaism, and they suppress worship in the temple and offerings in the temple that were mandated by God in the Torah. So so far, these 3 dates show us a force that is against the Torah, that does not want the Torah of God to be forever. And in the Torah, God says we must practice the Torah and its commandments forever. 63 BCE, the other part of the Kittim arrived, which are called the Romans. The Romans came, they defeated the Greeks, oppressed the Jews, colonized Judea, suppressed the Torah, and prohibited Jews from studying the Torah. So they did the same thing the Greeks did, but the Romans were violent to the Greeks. If you know the emperors of that time, especially Caligula, who was bloodthirsty, they murdered Jews en masse. People of Israel were murdered for their Torah, because the Romans were upset that the Jews have only one God. How can you only have one God? You must have many gods according to Roman law. But the Jews had one God because of Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 9 to 11, which says, actually verses 6 to 9, which says, Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, which means, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. So the Jews would not accept other gods or images. They would not bow down to statues. They would not build statues, even though the Greeks did so and the Romans brought theirs. The Jews didn't want anything to do with this. So they were heavily taxed. They were being murdered. They were being oppressed. Women were being violated. For example, if you're someone who's from the churches and you understand the New Testament, where Paul teaches that women should cover their heads. Sorry, women don't need to cover their heads because they're already covered with hair. Where did the debate of covering one's head come from? It came from the fact that the Romans did not distinguish between married and unmarried women. They were busy helping themselves sexually on Jewish women. And the Romans then ruled that among the Jewish women, the married women should cover their heads, and women whose heads were not covered or still to be considered children should not walk with their hair uncovered. But basically, the whole Roman agenda was to see who can act or play the prostitute and who's not eligible to play the prostitute. And they were careful, the Romans, not to upset the Jews, because every time that happened, the Jews would revolt against the Romans. All right, give me 1 sec. I just want to switch the lights on. It's evening time in Johannesburg. Just 1 second. All right, let's continue. So that's what the Romans did when they came in 63 BCE, and the Romans would remain in Judea for a very long time, continuing their persecution of Jewish people, and the Jewish people would always revolt. In 4 CE, actually it's 4 BCE, I think, not CE, because there's a joke in the church that Jesus was born before his own time, the people say. But I don't think I should put BCE here. It was 4 CE. Let's keep it at 4 CE. So this guy named Jesus was born a Jew, an Orthodox Jew. He lives an Orthodox Jewish life. He does not create Christianity, and none of his disciples create Christianity. There is a person named Paul who never knew or met this Jewish Jesus. And this Paul is said to be a rabbi himself, studied under Gamliel, and the Jews accuse him of creating Christianity. I say that if Paul was alive, if he lived and really was a Jew, he would have never written what he had written in the epistles, because no Jew in his right mind would write things such as the book of Hebrews and all the other epistles. So there's a lot of, if Paul was for real, somebody tempered with his work, because no Jewish rabbi in his right mind would write such things. And I can say this with all confidence now because I've seen what is in the Jewish scriptures. So there's no ways a Jew would write the book of Hebrews, for example, or even other epistles that promote another God. So whatever the church did in coming up with its New Testament, the New Testament does not belong to the Jewish people. It is not derived of the Jewish people. Maybe there were Jewish people who were used in writing the New Testament for the benefit of the church, but certainly not for the people of Israel, and never for the benefit of the Torah. So this Jesus guy is born, and he dies obviously in 33 AD or CE. He dies, and then in the year 40 after his death, what's called the gospel or the good news is preached among the Gentiles, beginning 40 CE, some 7 years after Jesus had died. And then in 64, this mystical Paul figure, he dies in 64. There's a debate among Christian theologians if he really died or he went to exile and then disappeared. What my opinion is that if he really did exist, if he really was a Roman citizen, his legacy would have continued among the Jewish people who were taken prisoner by this time. Uh, Actually, no, this is before they were taken to Rome. But there were already Jews in Rome because Paul is from Tarsus. It says he was a Roman. So if he was really a person that existed, his legacy among the Jewish people in the diaspora should have continued to this day, even among Orthodox Jews, because if Paul really studied under Gamaliel, as it is said in the New Testament, then he is in the line and in the house of Orthodox Judaism. All the sages of Judaism should refer to the Paul of Tarsus because he would have been like a rabbi above rabbis, but we don't find that in Jewish history nor in the annals of Judaism. In 70 CE, the temple is destroyed. So Titus, the Roman, after many revolts by the Jews, Rome sends this guy, the nephew of the emperor Titus, I think it was a nephew, I think, or a cousin, I'm not sure. He goes to the Holy Land. He goes to Judea and puts Jerusalem under siege until he destroys the walls of Jerusalem, breaches them, goes into the temple, loots the temple, sets it on fire, and there's nothing left in the temple except Jews who were killed, and their blood is everywhere in the streets of Rome, in the holy place. The temple is defiled yet again, but this time not by Jews, but defiled by the Romans this time. And there's a famous mural in history, which you find in Rome, where Romans are looting Jerusalem and they're carrying the menorah all the way to Rome. And Rome is quite proud of that too, because the Jews gave them so much trouble militarily. Rome was almost humiliated, if not humiliated, by the Jewish forces. And so, 70 AD or CE, the temple is destroyed in Jerusalem. And then 20 years later, in 90 CE, a lot of Jews are taken to Rome as prisoners, as slaves, to be specific. There is a debate. There's a story about Paul being arrested in the New Testament, and they find out he's a Roman citizen, and then he is given his freedom back, etc., etc. Very interesting history, but again, it's got nothing to do with the Torah. 90 CE, the Jews are taken away to Rome. So for me, I take the New Testament stories as just history, but it's got no bearing on what the Torah says about the Jewish destiny. So the Jews are taken to Rome in 90 CE, and then what happens sometime afterwards in 132 CE? There's a revolt, a Bar Kokhba revolt. A Jew named Bar Kokhba and his followers, they wanted to overthrow the Romans, so they revolt. But sadly, their revolt is thrashed by the Romans. But in the process of the Bar Kokhba uprising, a lot of Jews who had seen a lot of violence and oppression from from the Romans, they saw Bar Kokhba as a type of Messiah. He was supposed to be the Messiah. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. His revolt and uprising against the Romans was thrashed. And continuing with 100 to 300 BCE, which means the first to the third century, something interesting happens, is that there's a schism in the land of Israel. All the followers of Jesus that were not Jews, they were Romans and Greeks, they pulled away from their Jewish followers of Jesus. So there was nothing wrong with following Jesus at that time because everything was still Jewish and Orthodox. But it was when the Romans and the Greeks started to change the Jewish faith and start saying that Jesus was a son of God, that Jesus rose again, and he was the Messiah, and the Jews are bad. God is replacing the Jews with the Christians or the Greco-Romans. It started a schism, a separation between believers in Jesus of the Jews and believers in Jesus who were not Jewish. This is where this interesting and out of place idea comes from of Judeo-Christian. which you find in the academic world. Judeo-Christian is an oxymoron. You cannot mix Judaism and Christian ideas. But we understand that the followers, or uh, the disciples of the Jewish disciples of Jesus, they wanted to mix things that don't mix, Judaism and the religions of the West, which were basically polytheism, having many gods and many beliefs, having superstition, etc., etc. That cannot be introduced to Judaism. So a hatred started, and people like Marcion, who was supposed to be a Nazarene, but turning away from the Nazarene faith into a what will be later be called Christian, by introducing a replacement theology, saying that the Jews were forsaken by God. God will never love or save them again. God is now in favor of Greeks and Romans. The new faith that's coming out of the Nazarene movement. Specifically in 312, this movement was not called Christianity yet. So when history says that Constantine converted to Christianity in 312, it's not true, because Christianity in 312 was not called Christianity yet. So Christian history, there are holes in Christian history which influences world history. So there are holes or inconsistencies now in both in world history and Christian history. And I'll show you why in a little while. In 382 BCE, Saint Jerome publishes the Codex Sinaiticus, which is the first known Christian Bible. And it was basically the first New Testament manuscripts. The Christian Bible would come much later. Much later, it will be published even in the Middle Ages. But what resembles a Bible came from Saint Jerome. It was written in Latin. A lot of teachers in theology, in theology seminaries around the world that are Christian, they teach that the New Testament is in essence a Greek testament. So it's called Greek scriptures properly in seminary language. But when you look at history, Saint Jerome in the 3rd century came up with the New Testament in Latin. That was the first copy. It was in Latin. There's an argument that it was in Greek, Latin, and Koine Greek, which was written by the Jews. Now I have a big question mark, because the more educated you get in world history and in Christian history is when you understand that some things that are taught or at theology seminary and even in world history, they are all embellishments to try and prove a historicity of Christianity, meaning that Christianity started even in the 1st century, and that's not true. It's historically inaccurate. Even in the 3rd century, we see Constantine converts to this popular religion, but it was not called Christianity yet. Around 400 BC, around 400 BC, 8. This is now CE, not BCE. This is after. I made a mistake here. This is after Jesus. It's not BCE. It's all CE. So during the 4th century, the beginning of the 4th century, which is around the same time that Constantine converts, we have something called monasticism, where Nazarenes were living in monasteries and practicing a spirituality that is different from Judaism. And then in the 5th century, the first Christian church is built in the land of Israel. So let's look at what history is telling us here. So in the time of Jesus, there was no New Testament, there was no Christian Bible, there was no Christianity. He was an Orthodox Jew, so were his followers and his disciples' followers, until those disciples of his followers, the Judeo-Christians, they call themselves, started the schism through Marcion. So between the years 1 CE all the way to 100, there was no Christian Bible, there was no New Testament. From 100 to 200, there was no Christian Bible, there was no New Testament. The year 300, towards its end, appeared a New Testament or a Christian treatise, or what would be called later a Christian treatise. And it came in Latin. Today, you can go online and read the Codex Sinaiticus in Greek. But it's interesting because Saint Jerome came from Rome, so it would have been written in Latin because that's the language for Judeo-Christian spirituality. All the people that don't follow the Torah, their spirituality is based on this language of Latin and Greek. All the people who have a spirituality that is akin to the Torah, for example, the black people in Africa, our spirituality is not compatible to Latin. It is compatible to Hebrew because even our languages have evolved from Semitic languages. So our spirituality is akin to Judaism and not akin to Christianity. But we're not going to talk about that yet. I'm just sharing my understanding of, or just explaining how I understand things. And then around 400 is the monastic movement. And then in the year 500, the first Christian church is built in the land of Israel. So when they say that Christians or Christianity existed in the first century, it is unfortunately historically inaccurate and not true. Christianity would come with Justinian. Justinian, the emperor who ruled the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, what is today the Orthodox Christian Church, in 527 to 565, Justinian was the first person to call the Nazarenes Christians. My belief is that even by this time, the Nazarenes were faded because being a Nazarene means you are Jewish. But when you break away from Judaism, you are no longer a Nazarene, you are something different. And so when Justinian was fighting his political battles, he identified this movement that came from the Nazarenes of the church fathers. He identified it as the Christiani, which comes from the Greek word Christos, which tries to describe Messiah. And there's something problematic about the word Christos, because Christos in English has the connotations of the word smear or smeared, or the smeared one, meaning someone who's basted in oil. But in Hebraic thinking, Mashiach is the anointed, which means two things. He has been appointed by God, he's a king, and he has also been anointed with oil. He's a servant of God, he's consecrated to God. So the Christos and the Mashiach or the Meshichen, they are not the same thing. But anyways, so he calls them Christiani because they've been preaching about the Christos that has risen from the dead and blah, blah, blah. So Justinian looked at this movement and he said, no, this is not a religious movement. It is threatening my political establishment. So he called them Christiani. This is what it means in the book of Acts, in the Christian Bible, book of Acts, chapter 11, verse 26. It says they were first called Christians in Antioch, and Antioch is the country of Turkey today, and that was the Byzantine Empire, or the seat of the Orthodox Christian Church. So when was Acts written? People tell us, and we can see this in history, that the New Testament appeared in the 3rd century. But why does it talk about, how can it speak about Christians? How can a New Testament speak about Christians when Christians had not yet existed? Because the word Christian only exists in the 6th century, 5th and 6th century, when Justinian calls them Christiani. So when you read the narrative of the New Testament, you find that these guys are going around the world doing missionary work, and they were first called Christians in Antioch. Gives you the idea that within the 1st century, they became Christians, and they went to Antioch, and they were called Christiani, and it is historically inaccurate. So this tells us that the New Testament is not a book that is infallible. It has been embellished. What the church calls the Old Testament what we people of Israel call the Tanakh, and specifically the Torah, these are words forever. They will never perish. So we will never call it the Old Testament. And so that is the complete Bible. Genesis all the way to Chronicles. In the Christian Bible, it's Genesis all the way to Malachi. That is the complete Bible. So in the thesis of the Christians, which is the new, so not in the thesis, the treatise of the Christians, that's called the New Testament, there are irregularities when it comes to history. They are called Christians in the 5th and 6th century, according to their scriptures that were written 300 years before. How does this work? How can it be that you call yourself something that you become only later? It does not make sense. This is why the Jews read the Old Testament. They're like, well, it's cute, but it's not Torah. It's got nothing to do with us. And that is true. In the year 1445 of our Common Era, the first Christian Bible is then published as a New Testament and an Old Testament in the year 1445. These are the Middle Ages already that the Christian Bible appears. And the first one obviously comes to us in Latin, and then it gets different versions and different upgrades according to its translation. In 1517 of the Common Era, the Protestant movement begins. So by the time the Bible comes out, this is under the Roman Church. A Roman Church and the popes. So this whole pope idea begins from the 900s, this archbishop story, all the way to the present. So the church, the Bible comes out of the church, which is the Church of Rome, and then it becomes the Catholic Church later. Then a priest from Germany named Martin Luther is not happy with the theological propositions of the church, and also he's against the abuses of the church. And what happens by 1517? He reforms, he becomes a Protestant, he protests theological points of the church, and then the Reformation movement is born. And then by the year 1600, which is during the time of colonization, the reformers went to America. They came to America, running away from the popes and persecution in Europe. By 1738, the evangelical movement begins in Germany, right? It's very important for you to know that the evangelical movement began in Germany because Baptists, Lutherans, Seventh-day Adventists, and other Protestants, they are often called evangelical churches. I know that Adventists often rejected this label of evangelical because they want to stand out, but in the theological world, they are well classified as evangelical. And of course, their pioneers come from the evangelical movement. 1730 to 1740, the evangelicals appear in the USA. So they start in Germany, all right? Germany is important because of worldview, okay? What do I mean by worldview? I'm coming into the world of race and racism. Such and such a people cannot be people unless they have Christianity, or they have this, they have that. People are not equal, etc., etc. These are all, it all comes from a Germanic fountain. 1730, 1740, they go to the USA, right? And they continue this reformation, and it evolves into different corners of Christianity. You have Quakers, you have the Amish, you have many other groups that you could call sects. Sects of Christianity. The word sect is negative in English and in Christianity, but in Jewish thinking or Hebrew thinking, it really isn't. It just means divisions. So you have all these American corners of Christianity that are different from one another, but they are all driven by ideology, because this evangelical movement from Germany carries with it ideology. And of course, the discipline of theology as we have it in university It came from Germany in the late 1700s. Theology comes from Germany because that's where the big ideology of replacement and others being better than others stemmed from. It stemmed from that Christianity. 1831 CE, just towards the end of the American Civil War, Millerism begins. So what is Millerism? A guy named William Miller decided to revive a belief system that came about as a Christian apologetic many years ago, about 1,000 or more years ago, when the church was giving the Jews its apologetics. And so when the Jews said Jesus was not the Messiah, the church came up with apologetics saying that, oh, but he will come back again to fulfill all the prophecies that, when weighed on the Jewish scale, they don't hold up. So if you follow Judaism and Jewish tradition and the Bible, Jesus should not be the Messiah because he did not fulfill the basics of becoming a Messiah. But the church said, well, he didn't do it this time, but he will do it when he comes again. So this whole idea of the second coming of Jesus also stems from the Church of Rome, from their apologetics. And so the Millerite movement in America this time was reviving an old apologetic that Jesus was going to come back again. So this has to do with eschatology. Eschatology is the study of the end days and the end of the world, themes around the apocalypse. Why did Miller choose to revive this old apologetic? It's because Miller was a soldier in the American Civil War, and because he had seen all the atrocities that were committed in the war, he saw it as the end of the world, as something apocalyptical. The war impacted him so much that he wanted to see or understand the end of the world, because there was nothing far more violent and disturbing and impactful as the American Civil War. So he started this movement of preaching about eschatology or the apocalypse. This is what would give birth to Ellen White's writing of The Great Controversy. The Great Controversy is inspired The Great Controversy is inspired by eschatology. It's a book of eschatology. It's a book that interrogates who the popes are, who the Romans are, what the church really is, secret societies, and all of that. That's all based on eschatology. It's not just conspiracy theories, as somewhat might call them. It's based on eschatology, the need to understand the end days and the coming of the kingdom of King David. They say it's a kingdom of JC or God or Jesus, but it's actually the kingdom. It is a kingdom of God, but the king would be the Messianic king is from the house of David. In 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War happens. Actually, 1831 was before the Civil War. Beg your pardon. So Miller preached before the Civil War and during the Civil War. And in 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War reaches its climax. And in 1860, we see Millerism get a new name. From Millerism, it goes to the Seventh-day Adventism. So I don't know what made William Miller to think about eschatology except for war. And he started proposing dates about when Jesus would come back. And when Jesus didn't come back, he offered an apology saying that he went from the holy to the holies, and that gave the Adventists the doctrine or idea of investigative judgment. An investigative judgment which is not in the Bible. In the Bible, the judgment happens on the first day of Elul, and that's when Rosh Hashanah is. That's when God judges not only the Jewish people but the rest of the world. So if ever God had an investigative judgment, it's every year. It's not one date in 1884. It's every year God does that, and Yom Kippur is 10 days away from Rosh Hashanah. So on Rosh Hashanah, God, on the 1st of Elul, God judges the world and the Jewish people, and then he seals the judgment on the 10th, which is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which is not lost. It carries on every year. Even after the destruction of the temple, it has carried on. It's forever. It'll never go away. So Miller, plus the war, or a build up to the war during his time, and the impact of the war kept the Adventists on the path of eschatology. So when the Adventist movement begins, it's built on eschatology, the end movement, or the end days, the understanding of the end days and biblical prophecy, which concerns the end of days, which is why the Seventh-day Adventists over the past 160 years have always preached about the end of days and prophecies looking at the end of days, specifically the apocalypse. And so in 1860, the Millerism movement becomes a Seventh-day Adventist movement. And the nature of the movement is that it reformed itself from Western thinking, Western norms and beliefs. This is important for you to understand that the Adventist movement was moving away from the Western ideals back into a biblical ideal. Unbeknown to them, they were moving towards the East. In the book of Isaiah, I think, the prophet says that if you move west, you are moving away from God. If you move east, you are moving towards God. God is found in the east and not in the west. And everything around God, theology of the reformers, was moving towards the east and not the west, which is why the Adventist movement had so many people opposing it from the Western world, etc., etc. So this is just a little bit of history to form a foundation about what we will talk about in the coming videos about Adventist pioneers. And it's important for you to understand this last bit, that the reforms or the pioneers of Adventism were reforming from Western thinking, Western norms and beliefs. Most important to understand, because I will be going into the books of each important pioneer or impactful pioneer, like Elder Bates and Elder Wagner, Elder James White, who was often in opposition of what his wife, Ellen White, was teaching and supposedly prophesying. So I'm going to go deep into those books to show you why and how the Seventh-day Adventist movement was the penultimate step of the Reformation. It's not the ultimate or last step of Christian Reformation, it's penultimate. The ultimate step of Christian Reformation is Messianic Judaism, which was formed in the 1970s, but we'll go into Messianic Judaism some other time into the future. So in the next lesson, I'm going to introduce a little bit of, actually, let me do it now. Let me introduce a little bit of the Adventist timeline, and then I will expand on the pioneers' writings in the next lecture. Let's see what we've got here. Let me present my PDF here, which has the Adventist timeline. Alrighty. Hold on. So what I can tell you in the meantime, while you're listening to me, is that this video series is not against Seventh-day Adventists. It's not converting Adventists to Judaism. It is explaining why Adventism became relevant, why the Adventist pioneers became relevant in the Reformation. Why did Seventh-day Adventists have to exist? Now you're gonna see it in depth in these videos, and you'll understand exactly what they believed. My document here is playing games with me. Alrighty, so back in business. Let's look at some dates, interesting dates to start off with. It starts in 1860. And that's basically the time when the Seventh-day Adventists got their name, moving from Millerism to a much more structured approach to their moving away from Western ideals, especially when it comes to faith. So in 1860, we see the remnant was given the name Seventh-day Adventist. In 1863, the organization of the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventists in 1863, and by 1872 was a declaration of the principles taught by the Seventh-day Adventists, as is published in Battle Creek, Michigan, primarily written by James White. So there's a pioneer of interest. We're going to look at his books later, and these fundamentals serve as a synopsis of faith published in the pamphlet. So something important is the faith. Faith just means beliefs, right? This lays down a clear non-Trinitarian foundation, and was not replaced or changed in any way until 1931. It's interesting to understand that these were changed in 1931 when all the pioneers were now dead and gone and sleeping in the grave. These propositions are based on 1 Corinthians 8:6 and do not contain the term Godhead or Trinity. It's very interesting because there's no Godhead, there's no Trinity. The word Godhead appears in this American Standard Version Bible, which was printed to satisfy both Christians and Protestants. And then Elder Bates dies in 1872. In 1874, the fundamental principles of 1872 are published again by James White in the first issue of Signs of the Times in June 4, 1874, and by Uriah Smith in the Review and Herald of November 24, 1874. In his introductory remarks, to the fundamental principles in the Signs, James White states, in presenting to the public this synopsis of our faith, we wish to have it distinctly understood that we have no articles of faith, creed, or discipline aside from the Bible. This is very important to understand. And he continues to say, we do not put forth this as having authority with our people, nor is it designed to secure uniformity among them as a system of faith, but is a brief statement of what is and has been with great unanimity held by them. So basically, James White is saying here, we are not starting a new organization. This is a movement of people that have common beliefs. And their common belief is that they were moving towards the Bible, away from this Western mess of denominations and doctrines and creeds and etc., etc. They were fed up with all of this, and they wanted to come towards the Bible. The consequence of moving towards the Bible is moving towards Judaism. But were they moving towards Judaism or not? You are going to find out as we study further. In my opinion, they needed to find a Jewish rabbi that would teach them the things that they desired to know, the very things that they identified as their own faith and beliefs. And we find these both in the Bible and in the Talmud, especially in the Talmud, where it deals with different types of offerings. It opens the mind and the eyes to the sanctuary system, which is a fundamental thing in Adventist beliefs. Anyways, I'm not going to be tempted to roll over or roll on to the next lecture. We're going to stop here with Adventist history with Elder Bates. Next time we'll continue. Next time we're going to go back upwards in the document, and we will interrogate some of these things that the document says in the very writings of the pioneers. I hope this video has given you a little bit of background and a little bit of a history of not only Christianity and Judaism, but when did Christian ideas come about and where are they leading to? That's an important thing to understand, and that's why I introduced that incomplete timeline, but it acts as a guide for you. I hope. I'll see you in the next video. May God bless you and open your mind and bring you closer to His holy scriptures.